Let's talk about one of the biggest groups of the 70s. Uh, and like LL Cool J once said, don't call it a comeback. What am I talking about? Talking about Queen, not the White Album, but the Black Album, A Day at the Races. This has got to be one of my favorite Queen records. You know, to be honest, Night at the Opera, that meant a lot to me when I was a kid. But this album, I think, far outweighs it. And as far as quality and the number of good songs, there's really only two kind of throwaway songs on this album, whereas I think there's more on A Night at the Opera. But let's talk about this because there's some cool stuff about this album and some kind of funny stuff, just some neat stuff that went into this and just odd things that kind of make it interesting. Queen, A Day at the Races, came out in 1976. Got up to number one. Their second number one album in the UK got to number five in the US. I think Night at the Opera got up to number five as well. So they were kind of keeping pace. Let's keep something in mind. This was Queen's fifth album. The album before this, and Night at the Opera, blew them up sky high, thanks to Bohemian Rhapsody, of course. Then Queen, after that album, they were worldwide famous. So now there's a lot of attention and a lot of pressure on them. And a lot of the critics were watching, like, are they going to do the same type recipe to follow up A Night at the Opera? And when this album first came out, a lot of critics were complaining that they were using the same formula. But I have to tell you, Brian May said when this album was released, he thought it should have been released Night at the Opera, Day at the Races at the same time. Why? Because the songs were written at the same time. But however, there is a difference. After all the fame and money that came with Night at the Opera, it left a lot of space to experiment and do some different things with this record. And in fact, Brian May said that one of the biggest things going into this album was the sense of freedom. Part of that was, like I said, because now they had money, they had fame, they could buy a little bit of time, but they also dumped their producer, Roy Thomas Baker, who kind of, let's be honest, made Queen sound like Queen. So this is the first album that Queen did without Roy Thomas Baker. And if you go back and listen to it side by side with Night at the Opera, you will notice one thing about that. It still sounds like Queen, but it's got a heavier edge than A Night at the Opera and some of the other albums. And that's because Queen was wanting to, flex their muscles a bit. And so it really shows on this record. And maybe that's why I like it. They're not so frilly, but there's some balls going on. Oh, they got some balls to it on this record. Speaking of balls, it kind of could go back a bit because when Queen first started, just a little bit of history that kind of helps to get to the point where we're at with this record was, Roger Taylor said Queen was trying to take some of the harmonics and vocal stylings of Yes and combine it with some of the heavier stuff that Zeppelin was doing. So actually Queen was trying to bring those two kind of ends of the spectrum together in the middle. And Brian May had commented and said actually that even though at the time Zepp were kind of contemporaries, they were also kind of heroes. And Brian wanted to get some of that heaviness that he admired in Zepp and bring it forth on this record. And in fact, we'll touch base on that in just a second. But what's some other weird stuff? Let's just talk about some of the other what I find fascinating things about this record and why I like it. As I said, when you put these two, well, in fact, a lot of people see this record and Night at the Opera neck and neck. And as I mentioned, Brian had said they should have been released at the same time. A lot of critics were saying, as I mentioned before too, a lot of critics were knocking him, saying you're following the same formula. A Night at the Opera was their big album, a white album named after a Marx Brothers movie, made them worldwide stars. All these songs were written at the same time. And then this come out and people are like saying, are you doing the same thing? Instead of a white album, it's a black album. Has the same crest. They changed a few things there. Uh, they named it after another Marx Brothers movie, which, funnily enough, A Day at the Races actually followed A Night at the Opera in the Marx Brothers chronology. So there are a lot of same things about the records, and of course they're written at the same time. But there's differences. All the money, all the fame that A Night at the Opera brought meant in between recording before the band went in to do this, I think everybody bought a new house. Brian May got married. Freddie broke up with his girlfriend Mary and started, you know what I'm saying? And it becomes evident here, and we'll get to that in a minute. But things were changing in the Queen camp. A little bit heavier sound, and music was changing. We have to remember that 1976. This came out in the end of 1976, in December of 76. Do you know what else broke in 76? I think you know what I'm talking about. We'll get to that in a minute. Another thing about the heaviness was, I don't remember if it was Brian or who said it, but they were saying it's because this album was more focused on the performances, rather than the studio trickery and production, which again, if you look at it in that sense, this is without Roy Thomas Baker. The other ones had all that wizardry and stuff, which was Roy Thomas Baker. So Queen was kind of flexing their own muscles on this, wanting to do it differently, and really show what they could do. Let's go over the album real quick. I mentioned to you there was maybe 2 stupid songs on here, what I think was stupid. But let's just go over this real quick. On side one. Side one basically is solid. It is a winner. I got to tell you, Tie Your Mother Down. Strange thing about that song. Brian May actually wrote that song 7 years earlier in 1968, 8 years earlier. In 1968, when he was working on Summer Vacation, but they didn't get around to recording it until much, much later. Tie Your Mother Down, great track. It's also interesting to note, since this album was released in December of 76, Queen has played that song on every single tour they did after this record came out. You Take My Breath Away, that's good, typical Queen, right? Long Away. Interesting little bit about that for those keeping track of stuff like that. That's the first time, or I shouldn't say the first time, it's one of the few times that Brian didn't actually play his Red Special, his custom-made guitar, but played a Burns 12-string on that. So that's interesting with that. The Long Away. Millionaire Waltz. I think Brian May had actually said, I like that song. Actually, it was written about their manager, if I remember correctly. But Brian said that song is kind of really what encapsulated Queen. Like everything Queen was about, from the way the music was to the things they sing about, all in that song, The Millionaire Waltz. Freddie had actually said, that was one thing that set Queen apart, was that they were a very expensive band and they didn't play by the rules like other bands. Millionaire Waltz. You and I. Now, something interesting about that. You and I was the last song on side one, and it was written by John Deacon. And I have to mention that because in early 76, before this record came out, Freddie Mercury was being interviewed, and he brought up that one of the things that was changing within the band was that he was joking, of course, but somewhat serious. And he said he was really getting scared of how good that John Deacon was writing songs. And if you look back over the preceding albums, they gave John Deacon a spot. They gave Roger Taylor a spot to both sing and put a song on the album. So it wasn't all Freddie Mercury and Brian May. But Freddie had expressed that he was scared, and there's good reason, because on Sheer Heart Attack, just 2 albums back, John Deacon had done Misfire, great tune. On the previous album, John Deacon had written, which was somewhat of a hit, You're My Best Friend. On this album, of course, he closed out side one with You and I. And just a few years later, on The Game, he blew the doors wide open for Queen with another one, Bites the Dust. Let's get back to the rest of the record, though. Side two, Somebody Love. Interesting thing about that, a lot of people thought, oh, they're just trying to copy Bohemian Rhapsody, but not really. Roger Taylor said on that song, Queen proved that they could swing just as much as they could rock. Why do I say that? Because really and truly, if you listen to that song, and it's out there, you can read about it, Freddie was a big fan of Aretha Franklin and Ray Charles. But when he did Somebody to Love, he was trying his hand at gospel. And if you go back and listen to the vocalization and the style of that song, you can hear that he really is trying to ape Aretha in the sense that he's trying to do a big full, well, a gospel song in the Queen style. And he succeeded. So it was kind of Freddie's ode to Aretha. Weird thing about that too, I told you Freddie kicked out his living girlfriend Mary right before this came out. Good Old-Fashioned Lover Boy, which is actually a few songs after that, was written for his new boyfriend. But at the same time, he puts a song on here, Somebody to Love. So something's going on with Fred that he's trying to find his feet there, if you know what I mean. Okay, Somebody to Love kicks it off. White Man, throw that song away. Totally stupid song. Good Old-Fashioned Lover Boy, I just told you that was for Freddie's new boyfriend. The other dumb song is a Roger Taylor track, Drowsy. Drowse, however you want to say it. Again, throw that song away, worthless. Last song with the crazy title, Japanese title, Teo Toriate. I hope I'm saying that right. I always liked that song from the moment I bought this album when I was a teenager. I always thought that was a great song and kind of weird. And there's an interesting little story about that. And what that is because after Night at the Opera, Queen became so huge, as I've said a million times before, but especially in Japan, the Japanese were going nuts on Queen. And so Brian wanted to kind of tip his hat to Japan. So he wrote Teo Toriate and put Japanese lyrics on it with a little help, of course, basically dedicated to the Japanese fans. And maybe that paid off in more ways than one, because this album became, with that track on it, became Queen's first #1 album in Japan. So it probably had more rewards for Brian than he had thought it would. Now remember, I told you something was brewing in music. Yes, they were worldwide superstars because of Bohemian Rhapsody and Night at the Opera. And then there were critics looking at him like, dude, are you following this? You're just copying the previous recipe. You're following the blueprint, which, according to the covers, it's kind of the same. And of course, the songs were written at the same time, like I said. So in a sense, it was kind of leftovers, if we can say that. But more importantly, the music scene was changing. And Queen they'd almost found themselves out of step with what was going on. And part of that was, I think, none more evident than a famous interview that took place in early '77. Freddie sat down with the NME, the New Music Express, for an interview. And if I can read a bit of it for you, it's a classic interview. I'll try to put it in a link down below so you can read it if you want, if you're interested in that. But the animosity between the interviewer and Freddie is just awesome. But the interviewer brings up some great points. And of course, Freddie is, well, very sassy in what he has to say back to the interviewer. But just listen to this. Let me read this little snippet from the interview and think about this. Punk rock had raised its head in the end of '76 as the year was closing. So listen to this excerpt of this interview from NME. At a time, I tell him, of great musical change, when the new wave, how you like that term, is at the very least causing us all to re-examine our rock radio, our rock credo, Queen are alienating themselves from this very culture. Worst of all, they appear to be guilty of the cardinal sin, believing in their own myth. They did believe in their own myth. A rock gig is no longer a ceremonial idolization of star by fans. The whole illusion, still perpetrated by Queen, is quickly being destroyed. And in the iconoclastic atmosphere, there is nothing more redundant or meaningless than a posturing old ballerina toasting the audience, as Freddie does, with, "May you all have champagne for breakfast." That guy has some good points there, doesn't he? But what does Freddie say? Listen to this. "What do you know about showbiz? That's the way certain things happen, can be done, and that's a path we've allotted ourselves. That's the way we want to do it. Can you imagine," he said to the interviewer, "doing the sort of things we do and have written, like Rhapsody, Bohemian Rhapsody, or Somebody to Love, in jeans and absolutely no presentation?" Good point, Fred. Then he went on to say, "We certainly like being excessive. I know it's a nasty word for you, but we do, because a lot of our music is that. There's nothing more disheartening than if music was so overpowering and we didn't have anything to go with it. It would just be a compromise." There you have it. I love that little segment of the interview. But more to the point, the NME called this record, remember I told you it came out at the end of 76. And it's interesting to point out that the NME had said that this album was grotesquerie of the first order. Why? Because the Damned had put out their debut, the first punk rock single, or Buzzcocks, if you want to split hairs, depending on which camp you're on. The Damned had put out their first single, New Rose, in October, and the Pistols followed it up with Anarchy in the UK in November. So this double, knockout punch from punk rock had just happened before this came along. Did it have an effect on Queen? It did. Even though that little segment I read to you was Freddie trying to justify where they stood and everything, and because they were very pompous and whatever, it's interesting to note this was the last album of Queen with long hair. The NME interviewer, looking over their shoulders at punk rock, did bring a change in the Queen camp. Because when you look at News of the World that came out the following year, everybody had short hair in the band except for Brian May. And also, remember on News of the World, they did the song Sheer Heart Attack, which was a very punk rock style. So anyway, A Day at the Races. One of my favorite Queen records. I consider it way better than Night at the Opera. Pretty solid, 80% solid, except for those two throwaway songs, White Man and Drowsy. How do you say that? Drowse? It's also interesting to note this is the phase when Freddie started wearing a leotard. It's weird. You look back at Queen history and you don't realize that. You think Freddie always wore a leotard. No, he started his leotard in the few shows before this album came out. And then the tour that followed this, in their 77 world tour, that's when he started wearing that jacquard pattern, harlequin pattern, whatever you want to say, leotard. And Freddie's little leotard phase was during this and through 77. Because when you look at it in Freddie's wardrobe, the chronological order of Freddie's wardrobe, we start seeing latex and leather and a mustache by the end of the 70s. Anyway, Queen, A Day at the Races, one of my favorite Queen records. What about you?